and describe the case against God's people in chapter 6. Excuse me, I have to toggle back and forth between these two windows. Covenant. God hopes to restore the covenant with the remnant that's going to remain, and God expects the people to uphold that covenant by having justice, mercy, and faithfulness, which we're going to see a key verse in chapter 6, verse 8, that kind of summarizes that. And there are also historians interpreting Israel's history and helping the people understand why the events were occurring. So, for example, through Micah, we can understand why God used the Assyrians to siege Jerusalem, why Hezekiah was trapped like a bird in a cage in 701 BC, and yet why Sennacherib was defeated. We can understand why the people were taken into judgment, and yet why the people still look to God, that remnant still looks to God, and what is ultimately going to happen to those that remain faithful to God through this time. And so without this prophet's message, it's very difficult to make a connection between those historical events and God's message. So quickly looking at the timeline, we're in the time of around 735 to 700 BC when Micah was doing his work in the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, who were kings of Judah. Jotham, he was a very good man. He followed in the ways of his father Uzziah. He had many positive things going for him during his reign: building projects, material prosperity, military success. And then you have Ahaz after him. Just a quick reminder here, he was unusually evil compared to the other kings of Judah. He was the son and successor of Jotham and the father of Hezekiah. He did many evil things. He participated in the worst of the idolatrous practices. He burned his son, for example, as an offering according to the practices of the nations around him. He also made offerings on high places and under every garden tree, the Bible says. And then you have Hezekiah. He was the son and successor of Ahaz as king of Judah. He reigned for 29 years, and at this time, Assyria had really risen to kind of the peak of their power. He was known for his religious reforms. He cleansed the temple from idols and restored the original worship that was intended. He destroyed the heathen gods. He also destroyed the serpent of Moses, which had become worship. And then he kind of reinstated several things, including feast sacrifices. He sanctified the priests, and he organized the priests and Levites to continue with those religious services. And he was seen as righteous by God. God healed him when he was severely ill around 701 BC. And he gave him 15 years of additional life. And he delivered Jerusalem from Assyria whenever he was besieged. But Micah, he was perhaps not really all that impressed with a lot of these reforms, or perhaps maybe the reforms hadn't completely finished, because maybe it had become kind of routine for the people to worship God. Maybe they were just kind of fulfilling the requirements, but their heart was not truly in it. And so, just to keep in mind a few of the key dates around the time of Micah: 721, Israel's taken into captivity. 701 BC, that's when Hezekiah is trapped like a bird in a cage, and that's when they're being besieged by Sennacherib. 605 BC is when Judah is taken into captivity, and then in 586 BC is when Jerusalem falls. And here's a map of the expansive Assyrian Empire. As you see, it's expanding, it's really taking over, and it's working its way into Israel and Judah at this time. And then here's a separate map. This is kind of from Micah's perspective. Just to highlight a few of the things that we're going to see for the remainder of the book. We're going to see the concept of Messiah and his birthplace in Bethlehem in chapter 5. In chapter 6, we're going to see the Balak, king of Moab, and Balaam, and when God is kind of defending his faithfulness in this lawsuit against God's people. And then we're also going to see the example of Shittim to Gilgal. You see where the people kind of move from Shittim to Gilgal, and they're crossing the Jordan River into the Canaan land. And then here are some of the key themes. I kind of consolidated these down into 4. So The character of the sovereign Lord and the sins of the people demand judgment, and yet his great grace is going to overcome the sin. God's judgment comes in the form of this oppressor, Assyria, and by means of covenant curses, which we'll see at the end of chapter 6. And this is all because of the people's unfaithfulness. Second theme is a shepherd king gathers and delivers a remnant who is going to worship God alone. So this Messiah is going to come from the region that's under Assyrian control at the time of Micah. The nations are no longer going to flow to those false gods, but they're going to flow to the mountain of the house of the Lord. And through that, they're gonna understand the trueness of God, and they're going to be able to live in peace through that. And third theme is that covenant faithfulness must include justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And our worship of God must not be just in ritual, but it has to be true in nature. It has to kind of come from the heart. And then the fourth one here is God's saving acts in the past. And we'll see some of that in chapter 6 when God gives some examples of that. Those foreshadow his saving acts in the future, and his grace overcomes the sentence of sin. And so kind of where we are in the book, we're in the second sermon. Each of these three units that you can kind of break the book up into begins with the word here. We kind of think of these as the three separate sermons. Each of these sermons take us from judgment in the present time to restoration, hope, and salvation in the future. And so we're going to kind of follow that pattern as we go through the book. So now we're going to kind of pick up where we left off on Wednesday. So let's start reading in chapter 4, verse 6. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted. And the lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forevermore. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come, the former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. So I think there's a lot of people who have suffered from the sins of the leaders, those being the heads of Jacob, the priests and the prophets that we saw in chapter, I believe it was in chapter 3. So these leaders, they coveted the people's fields and seized them. They oppressed the people. They stole from the people. They took advantage of even women and children. And then starting in verse 7, we see again that this remnant is going to be preserved despite all this evil that's going on at this present time. And so we understand that God is just, and he's not only going to make things right in the present time, but he's going to make things right in the end as the eternal judge. And there's many times when the word remnant refers to those who are ultimately going to be taken into captivity and returned from captivity. But it also has kind of a messianic and New Testament application for those in the present time who are going to accept Jesus as Lord. And it says in Romans, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace, and there are some who are going to become unfaithful and broken off from that remnant because of their unbelief. And while many of those who turn to God have an opportunity to be grafted in, it says in Romans 11, note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness, otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. And to be a part of this remnant, we and these people during this time have to have faith and rely on God's grace. This remnant's not rooted in simply being related to the right person. It's not something that can be purchased, and you can't be grandfathered into it. It's not something you can inherit or earn by doing good deeds. No one inherently deserves to be a part of this remnant. But in Romans 11, we find that unbelief cut off those physical descendants of Abraham from being a part of that remnant. And so if it disqualifies them, then obviously it can disqualify us as well. And there have been many remnants throughout the Bible. God had only 8 righteous people at the time of the flood, and yet he did not change his message or alter his standards at that time. He didn't admit defeat or failure. He brought judgment upon those people. God had only a handful of men who stood up and believed when Israel was offered the land, and yet God did not move from his position. He had only 7,000 during the time of Elijah, another example, and yet he did not say, I have only 7,000. And again, when God came to the earth in the form of man, it was apparent that the remnant are those few who choose to walk in the plan of salvation through Jesus and the blood of Jesus Christ on the cross. So then we kind of move to verse 8, and we see this.
Let me just mention on that, those previous verses, that Jesus actually said the kingdom of God should be taken from you, Jews, and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. And when he says in verse 7 that the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth forever and ever, it's obvious that just as the kingdom was taken from the Jews and given to believers in Jesus, this new nation, that a new Zion also took the place of the old earthly Zion. Hebrews 12 said we come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the General Assembly and the Church of the Firstborn. So all these things have a spiritual fulfillment that was never really fulfilled totally on earth, but we're led, and your reference to Romans is perfect. He's just saying that this all is fulfilled in those who believe in Christ. The others forfeited, the unbelievers forfeited their inheritance, their promises from God. But those who believed in Christ were the remnant, which included Paul and believing Jews, that God had promised to bless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good comment. And God has established his kingdom here on earth and in his eternal kingdom in heaven, which we are kind of hopefully on the path to going to, hopefully kind of flowing to that mountain of the house of the Lord. But yeah, any other comments on that? Okay, very good. So then we have this expression, tower of the flock, in verse number 8. So I think that this expression is taken from the practice of building watchtowers to look over sheep or cattle, and it kind of represents God watching over his people from a hill. And then we see this former dominion is going to come through, we see in verse 8, it's going to come through the kingship and lineage of the house of David that's going to be restored through Christ's reign. And this kingdom will come through the daughter or the people, or you could say Jerusalem there. That's kind of what that daughter is representing, I believe. And in the next chapter, we're going to get a better view of the character and the rule of the restored house of David. So as we have read through the verses so far, we see God is making many promises through these verses, but we may be wondering how exactly he's going to accomplish those things. So starting in verse 8, there's kind of a transition here from the promises, and then we're going to see some distress in the remainder of the chapter, and then we're going to see how he's going to accomplish that in chapter 5. So to set up the next few verses, the next final verses of this chapter, we can kind of divide this into two subunits of text, 9 through 10 and 11 through 13. Both of these sections move from pain to healing and from suffering to redemption. And so before that future glory comes that we've read about so far, there's going to be humiliation and captivity, and then there's going to be return. And so this section here that we're about to get into is kind of an interruption of Micah's message so far, of that message of hope. And we see that captivity is going to precede the hope and of that messianic rule. So 9 through 10, we're going to see the distress and pain of childbirth leading to redemption from the enemies. And then 11 through 13, we're going to see the enemy preparing to overtake God's people. And that's followed by a comparison of war to the threshing floor, where God is going to judge the people and separate the wheat from the chaff. And then finally in verse 13, the end of that second subunit, we'll see further redemption of the people. So let's go ahead and read this first subunit that takes us from distress to redemption. Now why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in you? Has your counselor perished? The pain seized you like a woman in labor. Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor. For now you shall go out from the city and dwell in the open country. You shall go to Babylon. There you shall be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. So we see that the people are in distress in these verses, and the people are without a king, a physical, man-made king, and yet they're going to be rescued. So at the present time, that's going to be a period of distress similar to a woman in labor, but afterwards there's going to be a king who's going to be born and who's going to reign forever. And so because the people have sought to follow man-made kings rather than God, and have served idols rather than Jehovah, there's no longer going to be protection of the cities here. We see that they're going to be exposed in the open country in verse 10, and will not be overtaken by Assyria, as we may expect, since that's the major threat at this time, but they're going to be taken by the Babylonians that we see in verse 10, who are going to overtake the Assyrians. And yet, there's going to be redemption for that remnant that remains faithful to God and looks to him alone as their king and as their salvation. And so this same threat of the Babylonians was prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 39, when he tells King Hezekiah of Judah that all of his possessions are going to be carried away by the Babylonians. It says in Isaiah 39:6, all that is in your house shall be carried away to Babylon. However, Babylon didn't become an independent power until around a century after Micah's prophecy, and the Jews were ultimately taken into captivity in 586 BC when Jerusalem was overtaken. So then we'll move into the next unit of text, which again is going to take us from pain to healing and from suffering to redemption. So let's continue reading in verse 11. Now many nations are assembled against you, saying, let her be defiled, and let our eyes gaze upon Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord. They do not understand his plan. He has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat in pieces many people, and shall devote their gain to the Lord, their wealth to the Lord of the whole earth. So we see here that many nations wish to defile Zion. This setting is probably around the Assyrian siege in 701 BC. That's going to be referenced again at the beginning of chapter 5. And that's when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, he attacked the fortified cities of Judah, and he laid siege to Jerusalem, but failed to capture it. And prior to this, in 721 BC, the Assyrian army captured the Israelite capital of Samaria and carried away the citizens of the kingdom of Israel into captivity. But these nations assembled expressed their desire to desecrate Jerusalem's holy temple, and they don't understand the thoughts and the sovereignty of God and how He is in control of all things. He's going to simply use these nations. He's going to build them up and use them as an instrument for His judgment as He gathers them to the threshing floor. So I wanted to ask the class, what exactly does this mean that He's gathering these nations to the threshing floor? And as you're thinking about that, I have a few visuals of the threshing floor. So these are a couple of, I believe, ox, separating the wheat from the chaff, and some folks over here kind of, I think those might be the winnowing things, I can't remember, but they're kind of separating everything, and they have the bales here from the harvest. Here again, another image. So what exactly do you think this means related to war?
The good and the bad are separated. The wheat from the chaff are separated from the threshing floor. So
Right.
It's some sort of judgment that's come.
Yeah, I totally agree.
The wheat doesn't enjoy the process. It's a mechanical crushing and breaking and separating that causes the wheat to separate from all of the non-useful parts of the plant. But it's very mechanically aggressive. And so in this process, when it uses the referring to nations, it's going to be a time of trial, and the chaff, meaning those that are guilty of evil, that are guilty of turning away from God, are going to be blown away with the wind, like the wind, and they're going to be broken up. But the grains are going to be kept, and they're going to be separated from all this useless material and carried away to a place to be used. So it's really a great illustration of God's judgment in terms of through this time of turmoil, some that are going to be identified as the good wheat are going to be saved, but all are going to be judged.
Yeah. I like that you pointed out it's kind of a rigorous process, right, of separating that. There's not really a gentle way to separate the wheat from the chaff, from what I understand. I've never done it myself, but it looks like a pretty grueling process. And like you said, that chaff is useless. You know, it's not good for anything really. So you really just want the wheat out of this. So the war here is compared to harvest, when the Lord is gathering them to His floor by His providence, and is going to ultimately separate the wheat from the chaff in judgment.
What do I make of the beginning of verse 13? When the phrase says, daughters of Zion will rise up.
So you're asking, what does it mean, daughter of Zion? I think that's referring to...
We said that the threshing is a judgment.
Right.
But then verse 13 is saying, arise and rest, oh, daughter of Zion. Looks like daughter of Zion is acting. So my question is, what do I make of verse 13?
Yeah, I think that God is going to use Zion as a part of this judgment. He's going to use them, as it looks like, at least to me. I think that He's going to give them the strength and the instruments needed to destroy the enemies. First, He gives them that horn of iron to cast the enemy to the ground, and then hooves of brass. He's going to give them to trample them as dust. And I think it's more of a spiritual meaning. I don't think that He's actually going to raise them up in a physical battle, but I think it's more of a spiritual strength that He's going to give them. At least that's what I understand.
So it's a really interesting question, because in history, you know, it does look like Israel is the one doing the threshing here, but in history we know that they were never really strong enough to fill that role, to go out and conquer the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians. So I don't know. I think you might have to look at it as, you know, who was on the side of Israel, and who was on the side of Israel in this case is God, who is going to be doing that judgment. But it is a good question. Is Israel actually going to do this threshing? I don't think physically we ever see that happen.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question, because it is hard to kind of reconcile that, since we don't see them actually fighting a battle. So I think that He's referring to more of a spiritual battle in God's providence, and that God is in control during that time. Is there any other comments on that section?
The last two lines, I will consecrate their grain to the Lord and their substance to the Lord of the whole earth. That reminds me again of the idea of the remnant. You know, the process of the threshing. What remains is their gain and their substance, and that's what's for the Lord.
Right. Yeah, that's a good comment. Anything else? Okay.
Jesus is constantly pictured as being the conqueror with a rod of iron. And in a sense, His people, when they are following Him, are participate in His victories. And I think there was a sense in which those nations that gathered together to Jerusalem were threshed and destroyed when God called the angels to take 185,000 of them one night. But the primary fulfillment, I do believe, is spiritual, in the fact that the people of God, led by Christ, are victorious in the final analysis over those who are disobedient and unfaithful.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Because it could be physical as well. Sue was pointing out that 185,000, that may refer to, this section may refer to the destruction of Sennacherib's army at the gate of Jerusalem, when Sennacherib had besieged Jerusalem in 701 BC and trapped Hezekiah like a cage. You'll see in this verse that I have up here, Isaiah 37, starting in verse 36, it says, "The angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when the people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh." So this also could be spiritual, or it could be referring to this specific event. You know, we can't say for certain, but those are a couple of options. Okay, so moving into chapter 5, which I'm hoping we'll get through today, and then say 6 and 7 for Wednesday when we wrap up the class. Okay, so starting in 5 verse 1, "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth one, from me, shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. But the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel." So I think there's more wordplay, as we've seen in many other parts of this book. Here there's kind of a wordplay on mustering of troops versus the daughter of troops. Daughter of troops kind of points to Zion's weakness and their inability to establish an army to defend themselves in a physical way. In verse 1 we see that word again, siege. Siege is laid upon us. So the people of Zion are pictured as gathering themselves together in a city which is being besieged by Sennacherib. So these verses are probably after 721 BC, when Samaria has kind of been taken out. But since chapter 1, we haven't seen any other mention of Samaria. So we think that some of these verses are after that time period, but it was likely at or near 701 BC, because we see that word siege at the beginning of chapter 5. And the judge here, I think that's probably referring to the king of Judah, who is going to be struck on the cheek, is going to be humbled. We know that Hezekiah becomes ill and the city's under siege, so it could refer to one of those events. Starting in verse 2, we see that there's still hope for the true Israel, which will come forth triumphant. There's going to be renewed kingship through Bethlehem Ephrathah. So Ephrathah is the name of the district in which Bethlehem is located. So that helps us to distinguish from another Bethlehem, which is in the north in the tribe of Zebulun. So this Bethlehem was just a couple of miles south of Jerusalem. Bethlehem, for what it's worth, it means house of bread, and Ephrathah means fruitfulness. And so these are very positive images that we can associate with the city. And we know that Jesus was the bread of life, and his ministry, his life, and his death were all fruitful things. And then it's also interesting that we also take bread and fruit of the vine each week to remember his death. So I just thought that those are some interesting images to consider. But this town is described as too little in these verses. Bethlehem was also the birthplace of David. And so this unlikely choice of David as king also foreshadows the unlikely choice of Bethlehem as the hometown of the greater David, who is Christ. And these verses are also quoted in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6 as a prophecy of the birthplace of Jesus. The chief priests and the scribes, they recognized this was going to be the birthplace of Messiah. And then it also says the Messiah is going to be from old, from ancient days in verse number 2. This phrase, from old, is used in the Bible often to refer either to historical times or eternity past. And so it's most likely referring to the ancient Davidic lineage, and this confirms that the lineage was promised through David has come. See at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, where he kind of builds out the genealogy, starting with the son of David, because that's one of the key proofs in the Old Testament. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, starting in verse 12, I'll summarize a couple of these verses. It says, I will raise up your offspring after you. I will establish his throne forever. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So we know that it's going to come through David, and that kingdom is going to be an everlasting kingdom. And so I think that this is not only pointing to that ancient Davidic lineage, but it's also an eternal and therefore divine origin of the predicted Messiah. And this relates him to God, who we know is eternal. And we know that Christ is eternal and that the world was created through Jesus as well. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2, it says, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom also he created the world. So, and then Colossians 1:16, it says, for by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. And so I think that these couple of verses are pointing to the historical lineage and also that eternal lineage as well. And then verse 3, it says, she who is in labor has given birth. So although these people are going to lose their earthly king and be subjected to the enemies, God has a plan for them to prevail by delivering them through Babylon and delivering to them a Messiah. I don't think that this is referring to Mary's birth of the Messiah that we have seen prophesied elsewhere. For example, in Isaiah 7:14, it says, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. But I think more likely this is referring to the remnant of Jehovah's faithful who are going to be in distress, similar to the distress of childbirth, as they are in captivity during that time, and are later going to return as a remnant and give birth to the ruler or Messiah. And we see that in actually if you flip back to chapter 4, verse 10, we see that same image of the woman in labor and distress, and that's referred to the daughter of Zion, so these people, this remnant. Let's continue in verse 4 through 6 here. And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and in the majesty of his name, of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. He shall be their peace. When the Assyrians come into our land and tread in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. They shall shepherd the land of the Assyria with the sword, the land of Nimrod at its entrances, and he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. So we see here the image of the Messiah as shepherding his flock, and this image lends to both the tender care of the Messiah of his people. They shall dwell secure, verse 4, and verse 5 it says, he shall be their peace. But it also kind of points to the authority of the Messiah through the strength of the Lord. And then we see in these verses Assyrians overtaking land and palaces. God is going to use this time of war as judgment to ultimately bring about that peace. But we understand that peace through the Messiah is going to be offered to all nations. And the Assyrians can represent, in these verses, enemies of God throughout time. And the battle that the Messiah will fight against the adversaries is going to be a spiritual one rather than a physical one. And the Messiah that God is going to raise up is not going to be frail like man, but he's going to have the authority and the strength to win that spiritual warfare in the midst of all this disarray. So we get into some more cryptic verses where it says 7 shepherds and 8 princes. I don't really know if this is referring to an actual, physical group of people. I think that maybe 7 represents the perfect number to meet the needs of the people. We see often in the Bible that number 7 is kind of a number of perfection, and 8 represents kind of above and beyond what is necessary or what is expected. So it could represent that. So these shepherds and princes will faithfully lead in the place of the Messiah until he's born. So this could represent maybe God doing that work in a figurative sense, maybe a literal sense, I'm not sure. And we see that spiritual weapons are going to be used in this battle. And we see that in the New Testament as well. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, it says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds." In Ephesians 6, it says, "Take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit," and it goes on into detail there, but we see that this is an image that's used often in the Bible as one of spiritual warfare, but using physical analogies. So in these verses, we see the contrasting character of Yahweh. He's the God of Israel, but he's also the God of all nations. He's the judge, but he's also the Savior. His wrath is majestic, and yet he's astonishing in his compassion. He demands and executes justice, but at the same time, he promises forgiveness. He scatters the people, and yet he also gathers his flock together, and he threatens many nations with humiliation, and yet to those same nations, he also offers a path of salvation and peace. And then there's a reference to the land of Nimrod in here. I think that this was referring to Nimrod, which was the founder of the first empire in Mesopotamia. He was anti-God and built his nation with slave labor. So I think that this is just pointing to these shepherds and the Messiah who are going to provide guidance, and he's going to provide that path in a very wicked land. Are there any questions on that section before we move on?
I'm wondering if those 7 shepherds and principal men, pardon me, might be from outside Israel. God called some of the others, the rod of his might, in spite of the fact that they were not Israelites. They were doing his work in destroying Assyria.
Mm-hmm.
That's just a possibility, I think.
Yeah.
He's not speaking about leaders from within Israel, but leaders of Babylon and other nations that destroyed Assyria.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That could be. Any other questions, comments? All right, let's move on with starting in verse 7. We'll try to wrap up this chapter today, hopefully. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of man. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations in the midst of many people, like a lion among the beasts of the forest, like a young lion among the sheep, which, when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces, and there is none to deliver. Your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and your enemies shall be cut off. So we see in these verses a couple of comparisons. So why do you think that these people are compared to dew on the grass or showers on the grass and lion among the beasts of the field? What does this comparison mean exactly? Because obviously they're pretty different, you know, it sounds like. I think the showers on the grass has kind of a positive meaning, and maybe the lion is more of a negative meaning, or maybe it has some positivity there too.
One to me speaks of refreshment,
Yeah.
a reviving almost, and the other speaks of strength or victory, I think. So they both could be somewhat positive. There's a simile kind of point to that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Both of these look kind of messianic in the sense of, in the time of Christ, just there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think that the image spiritual or moral influence of the people among the people around them, as they're that remnant in a foreign nation. And rain showers are often welcomed in a very arid region, so we can kind of see this as a parched part of the world, especially spiritually, in a spiritual sense. And then the image of the lion is contrasting that a little bit. It perhaps represents kingly strength or power. The strength is going to come through their spiritual relationship with God, who's going to deliver them, and the remnant will remain in him, and no power is going to overcome them. Okay, let's look at the next few verses. I'm not going to read through these for the sake of time, but he cuts off the horses and destroys the chariots, and he's going to throw down the strongholds. He cuts off sorceries and fortune tellers and carved images. He roots out the Asherah, and so this section begins with the phrase "in that day," which refers to the latter days, I believe, but also kind of at the present time, because he's accomplishing that at this time as well. But it sounds like a very harsh message here, but I think it's a cleansing process as well. He's cleansing the people of all these things that they've been relying on that aren't Yahweh God. And it makes sense that he wants to remove the idols, but why does he want to remove horses and chariots? Seems like that might be something that they would maybe want to hang on to, maybe get rid of the idols, but keep this chariot, this horse, to be able to fight these battles, right? So why does God remove those as well?
They were not to depend on chariots and horses, so it would be a temptation, wouldn't it?
Right. Yeah, I think so.
Well, God's been showing them it's not the chariots and the horses that save them. So depending on those is against it, really useless.
Yeah, the people should be depending on God rather than reliance on military. He's pointing out the people's reliance on military strength rather than God. So it says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, when you go out against war and see horses and chariots larger than yours, do not be afraid, for the Lord God is with you. Isaiah 31:1, it says, woe to those who go down to Egypt and help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots, but do not look to the Holy One. In Psalms 20, starting in verse 7, it says, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And then he speaks of cold idols. There's a shift from the removal of cold idols. In this new kingdom, many things are going to be abolished: sorceries, fortune tellers, carved images, pillars, works of your hand, Asherah images. And God has told the people explicitly that these were not allowed, and they were not to associate with any kind of false divination. It says in Deuteronomy 18:10, there shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or daughter in an offering, who practices divination, or tells fortunes, or interprets omens, or is a sorcerer. Also says a little bit later in that chapter, for these nations listen to fortune tellers and to diviners, but as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this. And so we also see a reference in verse 14, to the Asherah images. These were carved wooden images of the female fertility goddess of the Canaanites, which the people were commanded to tear down when they entered Canaan land. So they were not to set up any of these things.
Yeah, these were all things here that are listed that they had trusted in.
Mm-hmm.
They trusted in horses, they had trusted in these images, these gods, and so on. He said when this all takes place, the Messiah is leading and the remnant is saved, they won't trust these things. They'll trust me. And those who continue to trust those things, who are unbelievers, they'll be cut off. They're finished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Okay, I'll pause there since we did finish chapter 5. Are there any questions or any other verses that you want to look at a second time?
I think it makes a huge distinction between the remnant and then the people of Israel. So if they didn't get it at this point, they should have known that Israel as a nation was not God's chosen people for all eternity. Because in 7 through 9, it's talking about this remnant who are going to be the dew in the line. The
Mhm.
very next set of verses, it's God that's kind of like tearing up people and destroying them and cleansing them. He said. So they were tearing up in 7 through 9, and then 10 through the rest of the chapter. God's tearing them up or cleansing them. So it should have been obvious to them that this is something that they needed to change, and that it might have been messianic in the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Any other questions, comments? I thought this was fairly interesting. So this is an excavated site around, I can't pronounce it, so I'm not going to try, but it was a site excavated around the mid-1970s, and it was a grim reminder that the pagan ways in Israel had been found and really mixed in with the culture. And there's one inscription, it's at the top of that bottom right image. It says, I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, so it refers to the Lord and his goddess, an idea that was utterly contrary to everything that we read in the Bible, but it's a clear example of, pagan influence on and how it had been kind of like mixed in with everything in their culture. Okay, so I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I'll just keep moving. So now we're moving into this class and most of next class. It's going to be this third sermon, chapters 6 and 7. Okay, there you go. So we'll be there next class, and we'll cover the next couple of chapters.